Hello, everyone. Welcome. Simon Jacobson here for another exciting and engaging conversation. I am deeply pleased and honored to have with us Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman. He is a well-known and one of the foremost education historians working today. His work examines how education practices and policies have developed over time, and the myths that often cloud our understanding of teaching and learning. He has a particular interest in how political and social movements come to shape education. A former Peace Corps volunteer and high school teacher, Zimmerman has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chronicle of Higher Education, New York Review of Books, and the Atlantic. His recent book, which really got my attention, and I think will get your attention, Free Speech and Why You Should Give a Damn, just published this year, and of course, apropos to the climate in which we're living. You know, speech has always been a debate. How much do we allow others to share their opinions? The Declaration of Independence, of course, the Bill of Rights guarantees freedom of speech, but it's not been that easy. History is testimony to plenty of censorship and control. And one of the first places you control minds is people's opinions, especially when you don't like those opinions. And it's sad to see that our own country, which is so much built on the foundations of free expression and freedom of speech, has lately especially been embroiled in this political polarization of trying to silence one another, whether coming from the left or coming from the right. So I thought it really be very relevant and eye-opening, and most importantly, perhaps can challenge our preconceptions about this topic, to have Dr. Zimmerman with us, call him John. And so I welcome you. I really very pleased to have you, and thank you for joining.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's great to be here.
Okay, so as I shared with you before we began the program, we have a very diverse audience, and which, as in any cross-section of a community, you're going to find people have very strong opinions. There are obviously people who don't have that strong opinions. You know, like the guy that said, I used to think I'm indecisive, now I'm not so sure. You know, so that, yeah, there are people who are somewhat ambiguous, but there are people with strong opinions, both on the right and the left, especially about politics. I mean, we all know what the Trump era elicited. And it's sad to see that even when you have a strong opinion and you really feel very deeply about a topic, that some people feel that another person doesn't have the right to speak. And you address this right head on. So let's go straight forward. I'd love to hear your opening thoughts on this very topic. And we'll have an interesting conversation. I hope we don't censor each other, of course. But really look forward to hearing your thoughts on this. So what's your feeling?
I thought, frankly, your intro hit it right on the head. I think this is a difficult moment for free speech. And it's a difficult moment because I think that there are skeptics and opponents of free speech on both sides of the political spectrum. And I think that makes the danger greater. So let's just take a very contemporary example. Think of these laws that are now being passed in state legislatures to prevent teachers from teaching critical race theory or the 1619 Project. Again, both of those subjects are highly contentious in their own right and subject to many different kinds of critiques, and I accept and indeed celebrate that. But the idea of us just taking it off the table or even making it illegal for teachers and students to discuss it, this I find abhorrent. And it's brought to you by people who in the same breath complain about cancel culture on the left. What could be a better example of cancel culture than these state legislatures barring that instruction? Now, let me be clear. If you turn on Fox News and you hear them complaining about cancel culture, say at elite universities, I think some of that is true. They're right that there's absolutely cancel culture at elite universities, most of it brought to you by the left. But it is sad and ironic that in the same breath, they'll complain about that, but also advocate these laws which are canceling in the most abject way. So that's just a contemporary example.
But that can be initiated also from the left. I mean, you can go both directions.
Absolutely. Right. I mean, that's my point. And so, just to take an obvious example, at many universities, including my own, we've developed these things called bias response teams, which allow anybody at the university at any level to make an anonymous complaint about a biased statement that somebody has made, which then triggers an investigation by the institution, sometimes remedies by the institution. This I find terrifying. The idea that you could anonymously say, I mean, somebody could be watching, Rabbi, this interchange right now and say, I was deeply offended by a biased thing that Zimmerman said. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to register an anonymous complaint about that to the leaders of Zimmerman's university, who are then enjoined to investigate this terrible comment. Now, again, this isn't a matter of law, like, say, those laws banning the 1619 Project, but it's censorship and it's chilling nevertheless. And I would argue that most of that is brought to you not by the right, but by the left.
Okay, I hear you that loud and clear. But let me ask you this. Just let's push it. This is the question everybody asks.
Yeah.
So is there any line to be drawn? What happens if someone's inciting others through their exercise of free speech to violence?
Rabbi, let's be clear. No right is absolute, okay, including the right to speak, okay? So you cannot call up the White House and say you intend to kill the president. Is that a limit on your speech? Well, sure it is. Or to take a more contemporary, or I should argue a more realistic example, I can't say to one of my students, gee, I really like the sweater you're wearing today, and if you wear it on Thursday, I'll give you an A. Is that a limit on my speech? It is. And by the way, one that I gladly accept and ascribe to. So to go back to your question, you can't say anything in any context. And what the courts have done is they've tried to specify where and when these limits can be. And to your question about incitement, which obviously came up on January 6th, what the courts have said is that if the state wants to limit your speech because it thinks it's going to incite violence, it has to be able to show an immediate and absolute danger in your speech. Because if it didn't have that restriction, again, somebody might watch this and just say, Zimmerman incited me to violence. Anybody could make that claim at any time. So what the court said is, your speech is restricted and you're not allowed to incite violence. But if the state wants to limit you on those grounds, it has to show that there was an immediate and obvious and absolute threat of violence at that moment and in that context. And this came up on January 6th, and I'll just put my cards on the table. I supported both the first and second impeachment of Trump. But I supported the second impeachment of Trump because, for two reasons. A, he did nothing when it started. And also because of what he did in Georgia, trying to put pressure on that other official. However, I was uncomfortable with the first item of impeachment, which was that he incited the January 6th riot. I think that's dangerous to make that claim. I'm not saying he didn't, but that's not the way this game works, right? If you want to show incitement, the burden is on you to demonstrate it. Did Trump incite that riot? Well, he did say things like, you've got to fight for your country or else it's going to go away. But what he didn't say was, hey, go to the Capitol, break the windows, defecate in several rooms, and injure police officers, right? He did not say that. And so please understand, in no way am I defending Trump's behavior. And I do think he should have been impeached. But I think he should have been impeached for those other reasons I listed, not for inciting riot. Because as soon as you allow that, Rabbi, the very next time there's a Black Lives Matter protest, a police car will be burned. And then somebody will say, did you hear that speech that guy made an hour before the police car was burned, calling police officers pigs? He obviously incited that riot. Let's put him in jail.
Right.
And that just doesn't end well. So I know this is long-winded, but to be clear, there are limits on what you can say, but we have to be extremely rigid and extremely careful about those limits.
Yeah, you remember, I don't know if you remember the Skokie March of the Nazi Party So there was an example that those, even if it was abhorrent and repulsive, but you couldn't silence them, because if you do, then you open up a precedent. What would be your opinion on that matter?
Oh, I think the ACLU got that exactly correct. I think it was a key moment for the organization. And I should tell you, as an advocate of free speech, I've been pretty disappointed in the ACLU recently, because I think if the Skokie case came up today, the ACLU would not defend the Nazis there. I think they're running scared in some ways because of their critics on the left, especially after Charlottesville. And by that, I mean, the good people on both sides, white supremacists and anti-Semitic rally in Charlottesville. When the ACLU said that they believed that those people had a right to speak, which they did, they received so much fire from the left that the ACLU started to make statements like, well, we have to take the context. I'm going to get this word wrong, but basically they say, we have to make sure that minoritized groups are protected from evil speech. And no, we have to make sure they're protected from violence, that's for sure. But no, the ACLU's job is not to protect anyone from violent speech. Violent speech is a contradiction in terms. Speech is not violent, all right? Actions are violent. And, the Times ran a long piece about the interior debates in the ACLU recently. And really, I think there's a generational struggle, and the younger parts of the organization are saying we shouldn't defend people like the Nazis marking in Skokie because they're hateful and because they menace Jews. Let me be clear, they are hateful and they do menace Jews. But those are really bad reasons to muzzle them.
Right, I understand. Look, the question also comes down to this, that so much has become politicized that people are also using the freedom of speech as a latitude, as protection for political positions. And that's where many of us...
I mean, in part, I'd argue, Rabbi, that's the point of free speech, right? Is to express your political opinions. And I think the really dangerous thing that all of us are engaged in now is that in different ways and from different sides of the political spectrum, we're trying to restrict it because there are things that we find deeply offensive. And let me be clear, speech is offensive. Like, speech hurts, Not only was I offended by the Nazis marching in Skokie, but I would say that if you're not, no matter your background, you might be a sociopath. Of course it's offensive and it's hurtful. But as soon as you make what hurts the barometer of what's going to be allowed, you're not going to be able to speak at all, because almost every meaningful statement is going to offend or hurt somebody.
Let me introduce this into the conversation. Coming from a Jewish background myself, which of course gave us the Bible, and in the Bible, long before the Constitution of the United States, speech is considered a sacred right. I mean, for example, the Passover Seder is all about, it's called Haggadah, which means to speak, to tell the story. We encourage the children to ask questions. We do not allow anyone to be muzzled, as you put it, or silenced, because, especially look into the Talmudic form of dialogue, arguments, counter-arguments. Nobody is censored.
Right.
But at the same time, and I think this is a vital component, you see, you and I can have a conversation, we trust each other, we can have very different opinions, but if we're both dedicated to finding truth, not dedicating to win or dedicated to some other agenda, then the fact that we allow everyone to say their opinion is great. Not only is it great, it actually, the cross-pollination, the argument itself will crystallize ideas. The problem is when there's no trust, when people are using speech, like let's say the media today. It's like entertainment. It's even inciting, and speech is completely, and I'm not arguing for censorship, no way. Because as a Jew, I can tell you that's not what we want. None of us want it. But more than that, but the problem is that young minds are being controlled by the so-called different factions,
right?
And you're moving away from intelligent conversation. It's not even about, okay, let's debate the issue. It comes down to the silencing. The very fact that you have to silence someone else tells you that you're not secure with your position. You're not looking for the higher truth. It means you want to win. You want to control.
Right.
So,
And yeah. And I'm glad you brought up Judaism, because for me, my own Jewishness has always been at the heart of my dedication to free speech. As you put it, the idea of the Midrash and the Talmud of kind of wrestling with these issues, and the challenge as a Jew, which by the way is a challenge for me, of squaring that sort of dialogue with a deep faith in Adonai. How do you do those things at the same time? How do you acknowledge that truth is multifariousness? Truth is multifarious, that it has a million branches, that the way that we inform ourselves, the way we get better knowledge is through dialogue and debate. There is no final answer, right? How you square that with a deep faith in God, I think, is a challenge for many of us. But there's no question in my own case that my Jewishness lies at the heart of my commitment to these ideals. I guess the only thing I would slightly contest, Rabbi, is the idea, that all Jews share that. You said, we're Jews, we want free speech. I mean, look at how many Jews have tried to muzzle proponents of BDS on our campuses. And I should say, just for transparency, that I find BDS anathema. And I've written about it, and I've written about the reasons I find it anathema. But, the idea that you would have the Department of Education investigating students on campuses that are advocating BDS and then devising sanctions for the schools that don't slap it down, I find that anathema as well. If you believe in free speech, you believe in the right of these students to propose BDS. And if you don't believe in that right, if you don't believe they should be able to propose BDS, you don't believe in free speech.
well, listen, free speech. Look, the Jewish people themselves have been victims of being targeted in the name of whatever the name was, and being muzzled as well. So it goes both directions. I'm with you. I wanted to say this. I think regarding your question, regarding the challenge of a one God and many opinions, I would tell you the following. This comes from my teachings that I myself teach from Jewish mysticism. Remember, the same one God that you can call a higher truth also created 8 billion people and counting. And there's an expression in the Talmud that we don't think alike. So that's also divine. The diversity of minds and the fact that we're not clones. God could have all created us all with one way of thinking. It's like, for example, all lions think alike. Maybe not, but they're essentially in the same vein. But created us with the ability to have very different opinions. That's also divine and sacred. What God expected of us is that we'd be wise enough to see our diversity not as divisiveness, but as thinking it like harmony within like musical notes. If you have a large composition of music, you can't have one note. You need to have many different notes, but you understand that we're all complementing each other, even when we may have very different positions. That's the key. That's what I really wanted to dig into and get your opinion, John, about that. How do we cultivate a climate of absolute respect for different opinions, even ones we don't like, but not crossing to the point of personalization, of hatred, that I hate you because I don't agree with you, and therefore I need to silence you. Why not see it in the context of harmony?
Look, Rabbi, that is the question of the day, right? It is the most urgent question of the day, because in this country, we are so deeply polarized, and we have imagined our political opponents as either stupid or evil. So the working assumption is, if I disagree with you, you're either cognitively or morally warped. Well, look, to the example of Charlottesville, there actually are some people I disagree with who are cognitively and morally warped, right? But I think they're a minority. 74 million people voted for Donald Trump, the most for any sitting president in the history of the United States. I should tell you, as a historian and as a citizen, I firmly believe that Trump was the worst president in the history of our country. I yield to nobody in my loathing of him and what he did. But at the same time, for me to imagine that all 74 million of those people are stupid or evil, that is absurdly cynical and, in a weird and perverse way, Trumpian. Because that's kind of what he did, right? You're a dummy. you're a moron, you're a loser, right? Substituting name calling for dialogue and argument. The great tragedy of imagining all those 74 million Trump voters as idiots is that that very imagination in some ways echoes the worst thing that Trump bequeathed to us. So what do we do about that? And look, I would argue that it has to begin with what happens, obviously, when kids are young and what happens in our public schools. Now, to be clear, not everybody in this country attends public schools, but the majority of people do. And I think this is most important. The schools are, as per the name, publicly controlled, right? They're publicly endowed, they're publicly governed. And I don't want to blame schools or teachers for this situation because that's ridiculous. But I will say that the situation puts an enormous onus upon them because the only way we're going to learn a better way of exchange and a better way of dialogue is by schooling a new generation how to do it. It's not natural. I don't think people come out of the womb crying and saying, well, I'm going to listen to everything that you say respectfully and won't kill you if I disagree. In fact, if some of the evolutionary psychologists are correct, it's actually the opposite. We're not really wired for that at all. Like we're wired for dominance, and we really like to be right. And so what that means is we need institutions, especially educational institutions, to school us in how to do this. Listening and tolerating other opinions is a learned behavior. I do not think it's natural. If it was, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in now. It may, in fact, be more natural just to hate on the other guy because it feels good in like a guttural way. And so what we need from the earliest ages and all the way through are to expose our students to multiple perspectives and to give them practice, which I think is the key word, practice, in how to address them. So in communities that are full of Trump supporters, you pipe in Biden supporters over Zoom, and you have them talk to Trump supporters from the earliest ages. And I've tried to do this in little ways where I work. After the 2016 election, I was so despondent at the low quality of conversation at the University of Pennsylvania about this subject that I contacted Cairn University, formerly Philadelphia Bible College, and arranged for discussions between Penn students and Cairn students. And again, let me emphasize, I'm not a Trump supporter. I was despondent at the victory of Trump, but I was also despondent at how little real conversation there was on campus. And so what we did was we brought the Penn and Cairn students together, and we learned some important lessons. The first one, to the point of these behaviors being learned, is that you just can't throw people together and say, talk amongst yourselves. It's got to be more structured than that, precisely because they've never done it before. So the model we came up with is what we call the wedding model. So if you go to a wedding, there are all these circular tables, and there's a dais, right? Where like the couple sits, right? So the circular tables, you come in and as in a wedding, you get a number, right? And we've staggered the tables, right? Penn and Cairn. What we found is if you just say talk amongst yourselves at the tables, it won't work. What you need are a couple Penn and Cairn students on the dais, like where the couple would sit. And you've chosen them selectively and coached them. And you start with them and you say, okay, just tell us who you voted for and why. And once the people at the wedding tables have seen that, they're more confident in doing it. And we did interviews with people afterwards. And it was really interesting. A lot of the Penn students said like they'd never met a Trump supporter. And they said like, I talked to this Trump supporter and he wasn't a bad guy. Like I didn't agree with him about, abortion or whatever, but he didn't have fangs or horns. And we mostly talked about football. What we need are more venues like that, and we need them to begin at the very earliest ages, where people are exposed to difference and also, most of all, get practice in speaking across it. Because if we don't do that, it's just going to be more of the same. There isn't going to be dialogue at all. We're going to live in parallel universes. I mean, we already do. Look at what's happened with vaccines and COVID. It's a perfect illustration of that. Somebody who thinks that COVID is a hoax or that a vaccine is going to put Bill Gates's chip in their arm, Rabbi, I can't persuade that person right now otherwise, because that person has grown up and lived in an almost hermetically sealed media and educational environment that I can't pierce. Like, it's too late. We got to start much.
But listen, to play devil's advocate, someone can say the same to you, John. They could say, no matter what I'll say, I will never change your opinion on Trump.
Well, right, but that's my opinion on Trump, and that's different from a fact. I mean, let me be clear. When I say I think Trump is a horrible president, I do not believe that's a fact in the same way as I believe that vaccines control COVID.
Okay.
It's an opinion,
Okay.
right?
I got it.
And more than anything else, that's the distinction we've got to uphold today. We can't live in a post-fact world, or we can't have a.
But here's where it gets great. Some people will argue that some people turn their opinions into facts.
Of course. Right. And it was Moynihan that said everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. And I never imagined that would be, or the question of whether there even are facts would be the most important question of my time. But now it is. The earth is warming. Human beings do share DNA with other creatures. These are facts. What we should do about the facts is different and is contestable. Should we be in the Paris or Kyoto Accords? We can talk about that.
I wanted to react to a few things you mentioned. Interestingly, and maybe here we have a good bona fide disagreement, perhaps, maybe not. In Jewish thought, actually the opinion or maybe fact, that can be debated, is that actually children naturally would communicate even if they have different opinions, and it's not acquired, and it's adults that impose upon them the idea of control and the need that I'm right and you're wrong. In other words, if we were left our natural accord, we would cooperate with each other much more, but we live in a very commercial world, a world of dog eats dog, survival of the fittest, self-interest, and children naturally would not gravitate to that until they hear from adults the need to impose. In other words, if we didn't have media and we didn't have any agendas, would we be arguing all the time, or we'd be cooperating all the time? Or
well, look, that's interesting, and it's interesting you put it that way, because I've never heard that. I've often associated these ideas with, like, Rousseau and kind of the high mark of the Enlightenment, right? And Rousseau, of course, believed that kids were naturally good, but that society had messed them up. But let's remember that, like, Rousseau fathered a bunch of kids and, like, put them.
The Quakers believed the opposite.
Exactly, right? And I will. I don't know if this makes me a good or a bad Jew, but I will confess some skepticism on that score. If you're a baby crying, Rabbi, what are they really saying? Me. I have some.
Okay, let's say. But me can be many meanings. Me and nobody else.
Right.
Me or me. And you could also say me, and we find a way to cooperate. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that into the conversation.
It's an interesting point. Yeah. And
in other words, if we were not affected by that, let's call it that need for control, the insecurity that causes so many people to not be tolerant of one another, that type of idea.
Right.
But I wanted to address one more thing. I absolutely agree with you regarding the education. The earlier the age, the more likely you can create change. Frederick Douglass said, what did he say? It's far easier to bring up a healthy child than to fix a broken adult.
Yes.
So there's no question that it begins at the root. If we can teach children, and I grew up in a community environment like that, where you have your opinion, by all means, you're entitled to state it. Now we're going to hear someone else, and they may say something exact opposite, diametrically opposite to what you said, and we expect you not just to listen, but to actually tell us what you think about it.
Right.
And not just say, you're wrong. What do you think about it? Maybe it adds something to your perspective. Right. For example, in the Talmud, there was a classic argument between Shammai and Hillel, two sages. Hillel generally was very lenient. Shammai was more stringent. Now, they both had legitimate arguments. We're not talking about right? And they're seen as both legitimate opinions, and they actually learn from each other. And we got a far more crystallized result because this idea was stretched in many different directions.
Right.
But that is predicated on one key thing, and that's where I wanted to really comment. What is the secret to the communication of people with different opinions in a civil way, in a way that we learn from each other?
Right.
There's a concept called humility, a little humility, that it's not all about you, no matter how smart you are, and no matter how right you think. If you do not have the respect for the sacred space and opinion of another person, even if you disagree with them, that ego is the problem. And ego always distorts open-minded thinking.
No, I agree with that. And I think that we've made our opponents into monsters, into something that's less than human. And, when I give this plea, especially to teachers, that we should be having these dialogues and that we should be having discussions, sometimes people will say, like, you're such a relativist, like you think that everything should be debated. And leaving aside the loaded term relativism, one of the responses I always try to give is, actually, no, my very penchant for dialogue and debate implies actually a shared set of values. You can't have dialogue and debate unless in some way you share certain values, the value of reason, the value of tolerance, the value of nonviolence, the value of debate itself, right? I mean, that's a value. And so none of this discussion and none of this dialogue will work unless we actually do share some kind of like lowest denominator ideas about our shared humanity. And I think that's what's under fire right now. That's what's being tested.
But let's take the example you gave before. 74 million Americans voted for Trump.
Yeah.
He could have won.
Oh,
and let's say 73.5 million would have voted for Biden.
Yeah.
So how do we create civility when people really, and for legitimate reasons, despise and loathe Trump, as you pointed out?
Right.
Others are more neutral and others love him.
Right.
And you have we're talking about a fair election, obviously.
Yes.
Where everybody. So how do you create civility around that?
Well, the line that I gave teachers during the Trump administration was that I thought that they should make it clear to their students that anyone in the room is free to like Trump. Anyone is free to campaign for Trump. Anyone is free to praise Trump to the hills. You just can't act like him. Because in Trump's behavior, he violated these kind of norms that we're talking about, right? So in my class, anyone can like Trump, but they can't call women pigs and they can't call Mexican rapists. They can't do that. Now, is that a restriction on their speech, to go back to your original question? Of course it is, right? But if you're going to have civic norms, you're going to have to restrict people from violating them. And the irony is that's what Trump did every day. And this is my question for.
Would you apply that same standard if you heard it from the left, if they use terms like that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. But again, I would argue that we've never had a president like Trump who violated those norms so consistently and so brazenly. Who used all that dehumanizing.
So how do you explain why 74 million Americans were not bothered by that?
That is a great question. And, I've had, because I'm also a columnist and I do public events, I've had lots of discussions with Trump supporters who have told me that they also despise his behavior, but they liked his political positions. And again, that's a legitimate response. Okay, it doesn't persuade me. But like one guy said, look, I agree with you about what Trump is, doing, but I think abortion's murder, and Hillary was for abortion rights and Trump wasn't. It strikes me as quite rational for that person to vote for Trump.
I'm sure you're aware, John, that there are quite a few Americans that despise liberals. You're aware,
yes,
right?
They fill up my inbox.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and you could say they're wrong, but they will say exactly what you just said, that, we may agree with some of your policies, but we don't like you people. We don't like your behavior. We don't like your arrogance or other things. Not you per se.
Right. No. I understand. And obviously, we're all imperfect human beings, and we all display arrogance and lose our humility and all those things. But in the case of Trump, I would call this a difference of kind, not of degree. We've had
but listen, I'm just going to play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Whatever, but that's because you have an opinion on him.
I do. And look, and nobody else is free to share. Nobody else is required to share it. And I always make that clear. But I have challenged Trump voters and asked them, like, insofar as Trump, uses all of that misogynist and racist language, and insofar as he calls his opponents losers and dummies and all that, like, would you want your kid acting that way? And
would you want your, listen, and I was once a part of a debate, and the person responded to that, would you want your kid acting like JFK?
Right. Well, look, again,
JFK was very gracious and did not use words like that. So
yeah. Nobody's perfect. We're all highly imperfect. But in order for us to get beyond this moment, and in order for us to start communicating with each other, we do have to respect some ground rules. We just do, and Trump violated them at every turn. That's all I'm saying. Yeah.
Well, in defense, not of Trump, but of the defenders of Trump, they would say we live in a society that is full of hypocrisy. And actually, Trump was refreshing because he said it and other people think it. Yeah. And it's acted out like it's just like when you find on television, everyone's bemoaning overt sexuality and other stuff, and then they just flaunt it. In other words, like the Me Too movement and so on. So we live in a society full of hypocrisy, and Trump is no much different. That's what many pro-Trumpers will tell you, by the way.
And again, look, this is a legitimate line of argument. It's not one that I share, right? But this is an interesting conversation point. And
because unfortunately, our leaders and our politicians are not saints. That's the
right.
problem.
Certainly not, right? But I would just say to them again, why is it good to say everything you think? Like, isn't the world messed up enough? I find this argument, although again, I find it, I'll admit, pretty hilarious, because you don't have to be Freud to believe that we all are kind of have some nasty impulses and we're all polymorphously perverse. And one of the ways that we maintain society is by repressing some of the things we're thinking and feeling. We've all had terrible impulses to hit somebody, impulses to say something incredibly hurtful, but we catch ourselves. And that's a good thing, right? Okay. Letting it all hang out is way overrated. And if the Trump era didn't teach us that, it didn't teach us anything. Like, I agree with his defenders when they say he said everything that came into his head. What I disagree with is the idea that that's necessarily a good thing.
Well, to bring it back to the theme that we're discussing, I think we all agree that people have to exercise that personal restraint. No one else can impose it on them. As long as they're not doing something criminal or violent, as we discussed, there's no question that freedom of speech is a responsibility, not just a right. It's a responsibility to speak properly. You have freedom of speech to speak to your children and tell them anything you like, but you're not going to tell them anything you like. You're going to tell them what you want to tell them to help them grow up to be the best possible human beings.
Yes.
So the challenge is when people's standards are so different, and we demonize and validate the other person's standard, and therefore the right to express it.
Right.
So I'm drawing it back to our conversation and discussion.
Right, and I think that links to the education piece. Right, is trying to teach a different and a better way of engaging with each other. So to go back, Rabbi, to your points about the media, just think about the media environment that our kids are growing up in now, where you turn on the TV and you just see people shouting at each other or past each other. And you see people denigrating each other in every way. And, young people that grow up in that environment and also in the internet environment, I think unless we intervene, they're going to think that that's what politics are. Like that's a legitimate way of acting politically, just to demonize and dehumanize your
Right.
opponent. And so we've got to intervene. We've got to teach a better way.
So where do you begin? The media blames the people. They say they're watching. We were feeding what they want to hear. And the people
Right.
blame the media. Where do you even begin?
I know, but, they're saying what they want to hear. I mean, this is ridiculous. Where do those wants come from exactly? That argument, imagine wants as sort of sui generis, this thing in their own right that just sort of exists like a capital W. Our wants are shaped by the environments around us. So it's extremely hollow for these media companies to say we're just giving the people what they want, because of course that absolves the media from their obvious effects in shaping these wants.
And I'll take a step further. Remember, let's not forget that this is entertainment. We're living in a commercial world.
Yeah.
Every media outlet wants eyeballs, and they'll do. Sometimes you go to the lowest common denominator, which is called gladiators.
Yeah.
Blood. We want blood. People. Yes. That's the fastest way to get people's attention. Is unfortunately go to the lowest common denominator, which is really sad. So to link it back to, if we had to spell out steps, what would you say, a few steps how do we even begin to unravel this or begin to stop the bleeding and begin some healing? What would you recommend?
I would recommend at a very first step that the first teacher meeting of the year, that the school brought in some advocates for the minority political position. So if your teacher lounge is full of Republicans, you bring in some people from the Biden campaign or from Americans for Democratic Action. And if your teacher lounge is full of Democrats, you bring in some people from the RNC. And you just talk. That's it. And it doesn't even have to be about politics. Because again, one of the things we learned when we did this with Penn and Philadelphia Bible College is people are so afraid of each other now because they haven't encountered each other, actually. What they've encountered are cartoons of each other.
Caricatures, yeah.
Right?
Caricatures, yeah.
Exactly, right? So that would be absolutely a first step.
Very good. I'll just, if I can just second that, I often tell people when I counsel people and I say, when you go to a party, who do you gravitate to? The people you know or the people you don't know?
Yeah.
Most say to the people I know. It's more comfortable. I say, try to go to the people you don't know and try it out. First of all, fresh air is always healthy.
Right.
And secondly, even if they're not like you, they may broaden your horizons. They may open up new possibilities.
I mean, I'd go farther than that, Rabbi. I would say they're much more likely to have that effect than your friends are.
I said it more mildly because from a psychological point of view, you don't want to assault their get all the defenses up.
But I'll be honest with you, I generally don't learn that much from people I agree with. Because they don't challenge me. It's like, oh yeah, Trump, I hate him too. I mean, what do you learn from that, really? I'm much more likely to learn from having a conversation with a Trump supporter than with one of my fellow Trump-hating friends. I do think that is the best way to learn, is to be in exchange with people that see the world in a very different way.
Have you ever been tempted where you're in conversation with someone you really want to shut them up?
Oh, all the time. I mean, come on. I mean, I raised 2 kids, right? I mean, which parent doesn't feel that, right? And again, this is back to the necessity of repression, right? You don't say to your incredibly annoying kid, shut up, you're being annoying. You say, hey, could we try something else here? Or, gee, I'm a little tired, you don't just say, shut up. That won't be good for their development, even though you feel like it.
Yeah, I want to share with you. One of the things I did, which was very unique during my years when I was a student. So my great teacher, my mentor, I call him the Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson was his name. Mm-hmm. He would speak on Shabbat and holidays, and there were no recordings or notes taken because according to observant Judaism, we don't write or we record on the Sabbath.
Right.
So I had to use my mind to remember verbatim 5-6 hours of talks. And I'm talking about almost verbatim, which means later producing 100 pages. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that how it transformed my mind to teach me how to listen. Mm-hmm. The key is it's not memorizing, it's learning how to listen to another speak, mm-hmm. suspending your judgment and your processing, and just be able to absorb. I think if that was introduced into the school system, I'm talking about all schools and all of us, to truly learn how to listen to another without processing and without stating your opinion, that can have a tremendous revolutionary effect of how we listen to each other, whether it's between spouses, siblings, communities, and of course, politically across both sides of the aisle and so on.
Rabbi, I'm curious because I did read on the internet that you studied with Schneerson. I'd just be curious, given the context of this discussion. I think we can all say fairly that he was a controversial figure, like within American and world Judaism, and that there were many Jews, and I'm sure you encountered them, who didn't agree with Schneerson, but more than that, felt that like he was a fake Messiah, and on and on and on. How did you and how do you deal with that? That is, members of your own faith community who that you have in some ways violated the faith.
No, not only that, I'll go even further than that. Being that I deal with many audiences, even outside of the faith of Judaism, I often deal with very hostile audiences to religion altogether and to faith altogether. So the general response is exactly based on my training myself and learning how to listen. So first of all, I listen well. I never cut anyone off, even if they're saying to me something that is offensive or insulting or even condescending. And I hear that all the time, you can imagine. So number one, I listen. I'm always listening. And my response is really based on person by person. Some people, it's a matter of information. They may not have all the facts or information. And I try to share that in a very, again, calm, not civil way. I abhor debates. I think debates are not the way to go, especially when egos get involved. So I try to inform. Secondly, even if there's a very strong question, like if someone will say to me, well, how could he have presented himself as the false Messiah? So I will say to the person, is that what you heard from someone? Or is it documented? Are you like sure that's what he did? Mm-hmm. Or did his students misrepresent him? And I don't even state my position. Mm-hmm. I want to just clarify. Mm-hmm. I want to make it into a conversation. And I tell you, people have told me, you know what? That's a good question. I heard it from a friend. So I said, why don't you confirm it? And here's my email address. I'm happy to continue the conversation. Sometimes people will be more informed and they say, well, he allowed people to turn him into a demagogue. So I said, look, the question is, number one is, would those people have anyway done it? Are you blaming him? You're blaming a student. My point is, I don't ever engage in a debate. I try to address the person, not the topic itself. And I'm a big believer in exactly what we're discussing, in facts and in the truths. The first things we need to establish, what does it state? Like if someone will say to me, the Bible is discriminatory, and they bring a statement, okay, let's address it. But if you're basing it on some corrupt rabbi that preached a sermon that you didn't like, or if you were abused by religion, then is it the religion that's the problem, or is it the abuser that's the problem? So I think, and this is true with all systems, if anyone were to present a Christian approach or a Muslim approach, like I am very intrigued by Islam. I always wonder, many people say all of Islam are terrorists, but I've read the Quran. I know Islam thinking, and it's not correct. Yes, maybe all terrorists happen to be Muslim today, but not all Muslims are that way. And there's a real text. So I always believe you have to have information. So much is based on misinformation. Once you have information, I think you then contain the discussion and maybe even the argument around something that we can say is real instead of hearsay. So that's part of how I approach it.
I think that's a great approach. I guess the only thing maybe I'd add is that for it to work, I think it requires a kind of agnosticism, if that's the right word, or at least an open-mindedness about the ultimate truth. So I always say to my students when a controversial question comes up, whatever it might be, gun control, the death penalty, abortion, whatever it is, I always say, look, before we start, why don't you try to identify some information, imagined information, that would change your mind? So the question here is, what can you imagine would change your mind? If the answer is nothing, we probably shouldn't have this conversation, right?
Very
Um,
excellent point.
you know,
Excellent
and
point.
so, like, let's say capital punishment is just an easy example. I should tell you, I've always been an opponent of that. But I will also say, if somebody could show me that putting, say, 15 people to death in the state of New York each year could deter 1,000 murders, I think I would at least reconsider my view. I could tell you I've looked for those numbers, and in my reading, they do not exist. But look,
Okay.
but I can
I,
imagine them.
I trust your position. I will tell you, I have met intellectuals and good minds who say, yes, I would change my mind, but then I sometimes sense they're just smart enough to find a way out of it.
Yes,
You know,
it's hard to be honest with yourself, right? And
I
it's
agree.
hard to
Look,
remain open. And yeah, go ahead.
John, listen, I deal with this question all the time. People say to me, you believe in God. Are you absolute sure that God exists?
Yeah,
So my answer always is, no, I don't have absolute proof. I even don't even have proof that I exist. Maybe all of us are an illusion, and
yeah,
maybe it's part of a computer program. I made a choice. I look at all the different, but I don't have, and people are pretty shocked. They say to me,
yeah.
I would think that you're absolute. I said, I've made a choice to live by it. That doesn't mean
Right,
I have absolute logical empirical proof. But you know
right,
what? I
right,
also don't have absolute proof that God doesn't exist, because as Karl Popper already said, you can't have such proof because
right,
it's not something that's disprovable. But
right,
I believe in honesty, and that to me
yeah,
is the key. I have no problem
right,
with someone telling me I've looked at different options. I've chosen this one. It seems most likely, resonates with me. To me, that speaks to
right,
me.
right. Unless they've chosen something like QAnon. See, this is where it gets into problems, right? Rabbi, I agree with everything you're saying, but at the same time, there are some people, some very bad actors, who aren't simply bad, they're wrong. Like they are objectively wrong. So QAnon maintains that there is a pedophile ring being run out of Congress by Democrats involving people that drink the blood of their victims. This isn't just an opinion. This is false.
John, as you know, we, the Jews, blood libels, that we would drink the blood of Christians. So we are quite aware of
That's
the
what it sounds
protocols.
like. I mean, the QAnon thing sounds a lot like the blood libel to me. You
Okay,
know,
listen. When I was a student, my teacher challenged me and a fellow student that I should defend Nazism. Okay, I
Mhm.
had to get up in a classroom in my high school to defend Nazism. So I stated right at the outset, I'm going to defend it purely for intellectual exercise, but not because I agree. And I made a case. I said, look, just as bacteria,
Yeah,
just as the white blood cells attack
yeah,
infections that enter the body, the
yeah,
Nazis would argue that there are some human beings that are like vermin
yeah,
that infect and pollute the human race. You may say, who are you to make that statement? You're
right.
not God. And who says, it's completely based on your own anti-Semitic discrimination? But that was the argument. I actually won the debate, unfortunately, which I didn't want to, because I did make a case for it. But it was really an exercise, obviously. But we all understand how repulsive and reprehensible, because we understand when you start using the mind alone, pure, you can go to many places that are not exactly where we want to end up.
That's right. Right. And this is the key. The key is to keep an open mind, but not
Right,
so open that it becomes closed to facts.
right, exactly,
Right.
exactly. So, for
And
example, but what would be your argument against what's wrong with murdering a little innocent child if that child is toxic? You
yeah,
know, but
yeah.
you can't prove that the child is toxic. That's the problem.
Right, right. But it is hard. All of this is much harder, I think, than sometimes we even admit to ourselves, because we all are biased. We're all somewhat narrow-minded. We all love the sounds of our voices. We all believe in our own press. Rabbi, I'm sure you've heard this joke a million times and probably told it, but for me, I've been thinking about as we've been talking, there's this convention of great rabbinical learners somewhere on the Pale, hundreds of years ago. And they come from miles and miles, and they stay up all night debating these intricate points of, the Talmud and Midrash. What did God mean here? What did God mean there? And then one night the skies open and suddenly God appears. And they all look up at him and they say, hey, you stay out of this. And I've always loved that because there's really something to it. And like a lot of jokes, it becomes serious very quickly, right?
Well, this deserves its whole full conversation of its own.
Yeah.
What the word, I'll just share this with you, and I want to tie it up and sum it up because of time limits. But there was a great rabbi. His name was Rabbi Levi Yitzchok of Barditchev, and he told a self-proclaimed atheist the following words: "The God you don't believe in, I also don't believe in." So in other words, I think it's vital to really have a conversation, especially about these matters, God, religion, faith, all these hot button issues. You have to define your terms. No different than a contract. What are your terms? What do you mean? If someone said to me, God is this man with a long white beard in heaven waiting to strike us with lightning when we misbehave, I would say I'm an atheist, if that's your definition. Right. I think it's vital, terms, language, because that helps diffuse. And I can tell you, we have limited time, but I can tell you my experience, 80% of the work of teaching values is to dispel myths and stereotypes. Let's define what you mean before you say, I don't believe, I do believe. What are we talking about here?
Right.
And there's a lot of distortion, and not even malicious. It comes from no education, as you pointed out, or it comes from long-held beliefs you heard from your parents, myths, anything.
One place it also may come from in our country is actually the decline of religious affiliation and religious education and practice. So this is something that most Americans don't know, but I'm sure you do. In the past 20 years, the amount of religious affiliation, that is the fraction of people that say they're affiliated with the church or mosque or synagogue, it's gone down 20% in 20 years. It's a radical decline.
And you know that 90% of Americans will say they believe in some form of God, faith, spirituality, but only 40% will affiliate with any religion.
And here's why I think it's relevant to this discussion. I think that there's some evidence that what has replaced that, if you will, that faith, is politics. And this is really bad and scary.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
People need to cling to something. And so if it's not, whatever, their church or their synagogue, it's like the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. But that's a really bad way to do politics.
Well, the big debate where Jefferson and Adams had a falling out was around the French Revolution, because Jefferson was saying that freedom is always good. And Adams was saying freedom without values, without some spirituality, can be real trouble. And he ended up being right, Adams, because his concern was, with all our freedoms, how are we going to avoid complacency and the apathy and the corruption that comes as a result of it?
Right.
Yeah, we're really touching on a lot of stuff here. Maybe we need to schedule another talk where we can address some of this. Yeah. Well, look, I want to let's because of the time limits, I'd like to. How would you like to sum it up in your own words?
I just like,
and then I'll tie it up myself.
Yeah, no, I'd like to say that I feel really honored to have had this conversation with you, and I think that my hope is that conversations like this one can help inspire all of us to have conversations across our differences. That's the movement that has to happen. The one thing we know from poll literature is, even though, ironically, people are hating on the other side and saying terrible things about the other side, they're also telling surveyors that they don't like the tone of American politics. It turns out that this is one of the only bipartisan sentiments that we have now. When you ask Americans across the political spectrum, are you satisfied or pleased with how politics is operating, with the tone and the idiom of politics, they overwhelmingly say no. And I think what that indicates to me, Rabbi, is there is a kind of longing for something that's better than this. I think we know as Americans, we can do this better. But I do think it has to begin kind of at the individual, at the school, at the community level, with practicing the kind of behaviors and values that we know can make us better.
I totally agree with you. I believe in the goodness, the natural goodness in human beings, which testifies to that and confirms that the majority will definitely lean toward both sides, that we need civility and we don't like the tone. I mean, there's always those cynics that actually like to play both sides against each other.
Yes.
And the silent majority has to rise up
Yes.
and not accept that. And I'm completely convinced. Unfortunately, the channels that distribute, and inundate us with information are part of the problem.
Yes.
So we need, this has to be a type of an internal, I guess, spiritual revolution, that we're going to reclaim free speech, but in a civil way.
And an educational one, a spiritual one and an educational one.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much. It was really very much food for thought.
Yes, I agree. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Have a great week.
I want to tell everyone, thank you, Dr. Jonathan Zimmerman, and Free Speech, his latest book, and Why You Should Give a Damn. It's available, I'm sure, on Amazon and all fine bookshops. I really thank you again, and I look forward to see you again at some point.
Vice versa. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.